He was repairing an old chest of drawers for a woman who had almost nothing left. But when he removed the back panel, he found a letter from her late father, and realized that this message wasn't only intended for her. See how one found letter changed 2 lives. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The house stood at the far end of the old lane, its porch sinking slightly into the earth, its windows half clouded with the dust of years. On quiet mornings, when the mist still clung to the fields, it looked like a house waiting for a sound that no longer came. Inside lived Samuel Rhodes, a man who had long since learned to measure his days not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of work and the hum of wood under his hands. He was 70, tall and lean, with a body that had not yet surrendered to age, but carried the marks of a life built from labor. His back bent slightly when he leaned over a table. His gray beard moved faintly when he breathed, and his eyes, pale and steady, had that quiet clarity of men who have seen too much and learned to keep most of it to themselves. His workshop was both a refuge and a memorial. The smell of linseed oil and varnish hung in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of sawdust. Rows of chisels, brushes, and carving tools lined the walls, each one oiled and placed with exact care. The old radio on the shelf had stopped working years ago, but Samuel kept it there anyway, as though its silence fit better than any sound could. A single photograph sat on the window ledge, a young woman smiling beneath a tree, the light falling through her hair. Her name was Emma, and she had been his daughter. He had not spoken her name aloud in many years. It lingered somewhere behind his ribs, like a breath that refused to escape. She had been the one who loved color, laughter, and the smell of freshly cut wood. She had grown up helping him in this very workshop, sanding small pieces of pine with her tiny hands, proudly declaring that one day she'd make something that could listen. He had never known what she meant by that. Later, when she was older, when her laughter had turned quieter and her eyes had started to hold too much of the world's weight, he began to understand. But by then, it was too late. The last thing she had left behind was a note so small it could fit inside his palm. "Don't blame yourself. I just got tired." After that, the workshop changed. The tools stayed where they were, but the air grew heavier. The work he once did with joy became something like prayer. He repaired furniture for the town because people brought it, not because he wanted to. It gave him a reason to wake before dawn, to boil water for coffee, to wipe down the table, and to listen to the soft tick of the wall clock. He had stopped expecting visitors. The world outside moved faster now, with new materials and younger hands. The old ways, the kind that required patience and faith, had become relics, like the man himself. That morning, the light filtering through the dusty window was thin and silver. Samuel stood at his workbench, sanding the leg of a chair. The rasp of wood against paper echoed softly through the room. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the shutters, carrying the faint hum of a distant train. He paused, lifted his head, and listened. The sound of a car tires crunching against gravel came slowly closer. He frowned. Few people ever drove down this lane. When the engine stopped, he wiped his hands on a rag and waited. The front door creaked, and a timid knock followed. When he opened it, a young woman stood on the porch, her coat buttoned to the throat, though the air was mild. She held a small boy by the hand, his other hand clutching a toy truck with peeling red paint. She smiled hesitantly. "Mr. Rhodes?" she asked. Her voice was soft, uncertain. "I heard you do furniture repairs. Someone from town gave me your name." Samuel studied her for a moment. She was perhaps 30, though her face had the drawn, careful look of someone older. Her hair was tucked under a worn scarf, and her eyes carried that tired, defensive brightness he recognized immediately. She reminded him painfully of someone who used to stand in the same doorway years ago. He nodded once. "I do some work still," he said quietly. "What is it you need fixed?" "It's an old dresser," she said. "It was my father's. He passed away last year. I can't afford much, but I'd like to keep it for my son." She looked down at the child, who was staring curiously into the workshop, wide-eyed at the sight of all the tools. "It's in rough shape," she added. Samuel stepped aside. "Bring it in," he said simply. Outside, in the back of her small car, the dresser waited. It was heavy, the kind of solid craftsmanship that hadn't been made in half a century. Together, they lifted it onto a small cart and wheeled it inside. Its surface was scratched and dull, the handles loose, one of the legs cracked. But when Samuel ran his fingers along the side, he felt the grain of fine walnut beneath the years of dust. The workmanship was good handmade, not factory-built. And something about the design struck him. Simple, military, precise. "It belonged to my dad," the woman said again. "He served in the army. We found it in his garage after the funeral." She hesitated. "He used to say he built it himself. I don't know if that's true." Samuel nodded, but said nothing. He tapped one side gently, listening to the tone of the wood. It gave a faint, hollow echo, one that didn't match the rest of the frame. He frowned slightly, but didn't mention it. "It can be repaired," he said. "You'll have to leave it here for a while." "I understand." She reached for her purse. "How much do I owe?" He looked up. "We'll talk about that later," he said. "Let's just get it fixed first." Her eyes softened in relief. "Thank you," she said quietly. She gave her name Clara Miller and introduced the boy as Thomas, though he preferred to be called Tommy. The child smiled shyly and waved his small hand before hiding behind his mother's coat. After they left, the workshop felt different. The air seemed charged, as if the dresser had brought its own silence with it. Samuel stood over it for a long time. He could still feel the faint, irregular vibration beneath his fingertips, where the hollow tone had been. Some craftsmen built double panels for structure, but this one didn't feel structural. It felt secret. He traced the edge of the sideboard again, noting how one seam ran half a centimeter deeper than it should. But the old habits of curiosity that had once driven him to perfection now stirred against something heavier. Respect. He had learned long ago that some things weren't meant to be forced open before their time. Still, as he turned away from the dresser, he couldn't shake the thought that the piece was alive with more than age. That night, when he closed the workshop, he left the lamp burning low. The light fell across the dresser's surface, turning the wood to amber, the scratches into faint scars that glimmered like veins. He sat on the stool by the window, his cup of coffee cooling beside him, and watched the slow fade of daylight. His reflection in the glass seemed older, almost ghostly. He remembered the nights he and Emma had worked late, the smell of resin and the sound of her humming tunelessly as she painted the edges of some toy or chair. The house creaked softly, settling into its bones. Samuel rose, placed a hand on the dresser, and felt again that curious vibration, like a breath caught inside. For a moment he almost spoke to it, the way one might to a sleeping child. Instead, he turned off the light and whispered to the silence, "Tomorrow, then." Morning came gray and windless. The sky hung low, and the smell of rain drifted through the open window. Samuel brewed his coffee and carried it into the workshop. The dresser waited where he had left it, patient and solemn. He set the mug down, rolled up his sleeves, and began removing the drawers one by one. Each came out stiffly, scraping against the sides, the wood swollen from years of humidity. Inside, the compartments were lined with faded paper that had once been floral. he found traces of old varnish, dust, and a small child's drawing taped to the underside of one board, a crooked house, and a sun drawn in crayon. He paused, tracing the faint wax lines with his thumb. Something about it, simple, honest, unguarded, reminded him of his daughter's early sketches. He worked carefully through the morning, sanding, tightening, mending joints. The hum of his tools filled the space, rhythmic, almost meditative. When he stopped for lunch, the room smelled of oil and pine dust. He sat back, staring at the piece, and found his mind drifting to the woman who had brought it. Clara. She had the same air of restrained grief that he had carried for years, the kind that doesn't scream, but settles deep, changing the posture of a person forever. He wondered about her father, about the way soldiers sometimes built things, not for beauty, but for endurance, for the comfort of holding something stable when everything else collapses. As evening drew near, the first drops of rain began to fall. The steady drumming against the roof filled the quiet. Samuel stood by the window, watching the water trail down the glass. Behind him, the dresser seemed to absorb the dim light, its surface reflecting a dull glow. He walked back to it, ran his fingers once more along the side, and tapped again where the sound had been hollow. There it was, the same muted thud. A hidden space, perfectly concealed. He thought of the military precision, the careful joinery, the way the panels had been fitted, not with nails, but with wooden pegs. Whoever built this had known exactly what he was doing. Samuel's first instinct was to reach for his chisel, to uncover what lay beneath. But he stopped himself. The echo of a memory, his daughter's voice saying, "You can't rush a heartbeat, Papa. Even wood needs time to tell you its story," passed through him. He smiled faintly at the thought. He decided to wait. Some things revealed themselves only to patience. That night, the rain grew heavier. Samuel sat by the window again, listening to the sound of it striking the tin roof. The photograph of Emma caught a glimmer of lamplight, her smile still soft, still young. He thought about the way grief could stretch across years and still feel close enough to touch. The dresser, the woman, the small boy, all of it felt like a circle slowly closing in, something unfinished that had returned to find its ending. When he finally rose to turn out the light, he glanced back once more at the old dresser, standing solemnly in the corner of the workshop. The reflection of the lamp danced across its marble top. For a moment, he thought he saw movement beneath the surface. A trick of light, perhaps, or just the trembling of the flame. But he felt the faintest pulse of warmth beneath his fingertips. He whispered to the quiet, "We'll see what you've been hiding, old friend. Just not tonight." The rain continued long into the small hours, and in the steady rhythm of it, Samuel dreamed not of his daughter's death, as he often did, but of her laughter, of her small hands brushing away the dust from a freshly sanded board. Somewhere in the dream, a voice gentle, unfamiliar, yet kind, seemed to murmur through the sound of rain. "You'll know when it's time." When he awoke before dawn, the workshop waited. The air felt charged, like the pause before a story begins. The dresser stood silent, but not empty. And as he poured his coffee and turned on the lamp, Samuel Rhodes felt for the first time in years that he was not alone in the silence. Morning came pale and still, the kind of light that carried no warmth, yet made everything visible, honest. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving behind the smell of damp earth and fresh cut air. Samuel stood by the window of his kitchen, a steaming mug in his hand, staring out toward the thin line of trees that bordered his yard. The world seemed softer after rain, edges blurred, sounds distant. He finished his coffee without hurry, then crossed to the workshop where the old dresser waited. It stood just as he had left it, dull, solid, patient. A faint line of moisture shimmered along the edge of the window pane beside it, casting the faintest gleam on the wood. Samuel placed his hand on the surface. The wood was cold now, almost reluctant to speak. He set down the mug, rolled up his sleeves, and began to work. The quiet filled the room like breath. He started by tightening the back joints, replacing one of the warped rails. As he worked, his mind drifted not in words, but in feelings. He thought of the woman who had brought it, of her weary smile, of the little boy with the toy truck. There had been something fragile about them both, as though they were carrying too much of life in too small a space. He had seen that kind of look before, on the faces of widows after the war, on the parents who came for broken keepsakes, hoping they could be repaired, even when what they truly wanted back was gone. The dresser was old, but the construction was remarkable. The man who built it had understood weight and silence, how to make wood carry meaning beyond function. Samuel recognized certain details, hand-cut dovetails, the faint ridge where the craftsman's knife had hesitated. That kind of precision came only from care, not speed. Whoever built it had done so with intention. By midday, the air had warmed slightly, and the smell of polish and pine oil spread through the room. Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned back. When he tapped the left side panel again, the sound that came back was wrong, dull and heavy, as though the wood hid something it did not want revealed. He frowned, then pressed his fingers along the seam. There was the faintest give. He hesitated. For a long time, he simply stood there, palm against the wood, listening. The silence between him and the dresser felt almost alive. He thought of Emma again, how she had once told him that every piece of furniture was a letter, written in a language only patience could translate. She used to place her ear against the boards and claim she could hear the heart of the tree still beating. It had been years since he had let himself believe in anything like that. But now, standing there, he felt the faint pulse of something waiting beneath the surface. Slowly, carefully, he took up a chisel. He began removing the small nails one by one. The wood creaked, groaned a little, but held. Each motion required control. One wrong move could splinter the grain and ruin everything. Beneath the outer layer, he found a second, thinner board fitted so precisely it looked like part of the structure. When he loosened it, dust spilled out in a soft gray breath, as though the thing itself sighed with release. Behind it lay a small bundle, wrapped in faded army green cloth. For a moment, Samuel simply stared. He had not expected to find anything, at least, not something this deliberate. He reached out, his hands trembling slightly, and drew the bundle out. The cloth was dry and brittle, fraying at the corners, and tied with a thin leather cord that cracked as he untied it. Inside were several folded bills, yellowed by time, an old military identification tag, and a letter sealed in an envelope that had long since lost its glue. He opened the letter with the same care he would give to something sacred. The handwriting was uneven. The ink faded into the paper, but it was legible. "My dear Clara," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone. There isn't much here, just what I could set aside before I left. You always said life had a way of testing people. If this day has come, then you've been tested too. Take what's here and use it. I wish I could see you grow, see your child laugh, see peace in your eyes. But if I can't, let this be my hand on your shoulder, reminding you that you are never alone. You are stronger than the world lets you believe. Whatever you face it with your head high. You carry my name, but you owe nothing to it, only to yourself. Love. Always. Dad." Samuel's throat tightened as he read. The words blurred, his vision shimmering with unshed tears. He laid the letter on the table, staring at the handwriting as though it might move. The signature simply Dad felt both intimate and unbearable. The air seemed to hum with something tender, something long buried. He sat for a long time without moving. Memories he had kept, locked away, pressed forward, slow and relentless. Emma had left no letter, no explanation, no comfort, only that single line, "Don't blame yourself." And yet here, in his trembling hands, was a father's last attempt to reach his child from beyond the silence. It was as though the universe had rewritten his own story in someone else's ink, giving him a glimpse of what might have been if he had found the right words in time. His hands shook slightly as he refolded the paper. He could still smell the faint trace of tobacco and oil on it, as though the man who wrote it had been much like himself. A worker, a craftsman, a soldier perhaps, who had learned that the things we build outlast the things we say. He looked at the photograph tucked behind the bills, a man in uniform holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. The man was smiling, his face strong but kind, eyes bright with pride. He was the sort of father who believed love could be built with hands. Samuel placed everything gently back into the cloth and stared at the empty space behind the panel. He knew he couldn't keep it. It belonged to the woman, to her story, not his. Yet something inside him resisted the idea of simply handing it over. The letter had stirred something old and fragile in him, something that had lain dormant since the day his daughter's laughter stopped filling his home. He rose from the bench and walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon light had softened into a gold haze. Birds fluttered across the telephone wires, the kind of small motion that reminded him the world continued whether one noticed or not. He stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the sill, thinking, to tell her or not to tell her? That was the question now pressing against him. If he told her, she would have the money, the medal, the letter. She would know her father had loved her enough to prepare for her hardest day. It might change her life, might give her peace, but it would also reopen the wound of his own failure, his inability to give Emma the same kind of farewell. For years he had lived with the quiet punishment of not knowing how to save her. Returning this letter would save someone else instead. Perhaps that was enough. But a quieter voice in him, one that sounded eerily like Emma's, whispered that it wasn't his to keep, not even for a day. The thought hurt more than he expected. He sat down again and unfolded the letter once more, reading it slowly, word by word, as if memorizing a prayer. When he finished, he didn't put it away immediately. Instead, he laid it flat on the table, smoothing the creases, and just looked at it. The ink, faded though it was, still carried warmth. The hand that wrote it had likely been shaking, just as his did now. He could almost imagine the man sitting somewhere far away, perhaps in a tent, perhaps in a quiet corner of a base writing these lines before a mission, before an end he already sensed coming. Samuel knew about those moments. He had written his own letters like that once, back when war was still close, and every sunrise could be the last. He never sent most of them. They were burned long ago, but one or two had survived in memory. They had been addressed to Emma, written in the hope she would never need them. And now, decades later, here he was, holding a stranger's letter that had survived for a daughter who didn't know it existed. By nightfall, he had decided. He would restore the dresser, hide the letter and the small bundle exactly where he found them, and return the piece to Clara without a word. She would find it eventually. When the time was right, when she needed it most, she would discover it the way such things were meant to be discovered, not as a gift from someone else, but as a sign that life had not forgotten her. He worked through the evening with renewed care. The tools moved softly in his hands, their rhythm almost like breathing. He sanded the wood, smoothed the edges, filled the cracks with resin the color of honey. The sound of the plane sliding across the grain reminded him of lullabies once sung softly in a dimly lit room. Each motion was deliberate, almost reverent. He felt as though he were repairing more than furniture. He was mending the thread between past and present, between fathers and daughters. When the piece was finally complete, he stepped back to look at it. The wood gleamed faintly in the lamplight, its surface smooth and rich once again. He ran his palm across it, feeling the warmth that seemed to rise from within. The hollow echo was gone now, replaced by a quiet solidity, as if the secret it carried had finally settled into peace. He sat down and wrote a short note for Clara. "The dresser is ready. Some things are fixed with nails and polish, others with patience. Yours was both." He left the note on the edge of his workbench. Before closing the workshop, he walked to the window one last time. The sky outside had turned deep blue, the horizon painted with the last traces of dusk. He thought of the letter sealed once again behind the panel, waiting like a whisper. Somewhere, he imagined, a small boy would one day play beside this dresser, his mother telling him stories about the grandfather he never met. And one day, perhaps, she would find the letter, and the words would cross the years to reach her, just as these words had reached him. Samuel turned off the lamp, but the light seemed to linger in the wood itself. As he closed the door behind him, he felt the faintest shift inside his chest. Not quite relief, not quite sorrow, but something gentler, something that almost felt like forgiveness. That night, sleep came slowly. The rain returned just before dawn, and in his dreams, Samuel saw his daughter again, sitting by his workbench, her hands covered in sawdust, smiling the way she used to when she finished sanding a board. "You listened," she said softly. "That's all it ever takes." When he awoke, her words stayed with him like the echo of a song. The workshop waited, filled with the scent of rain and polished wood, and the promise of morning. The day Clara returned was bright and windless, the kind of morning that seemed to hum quietly under its own weight. Samuel had risen early, as he always did, though there was no work waiting for him now. The dresser stood gleaming in the corner of his workshop, finished, perfect in its silence. For 2 nights he had sat beside it long after midnight, the lamp burning low, listening to the faint settling sounds of the house, the creak of boards contracting with the cool air. He had not touched the letter again. It remained sealed away behind the panel, resting where it belonged. The decision to keep his silence had felt right, though it carried a strange ache with it, a tenderness that left his hands unsteady. When the knock came, he already knew it was her. He opened the door and saw Clara standing on the porch, her boy half hidden behind her legs. She smiled with that same hesitant gratitude, as though unsure she had the right to be there. "Good morning, Mr. Rhodes," she said softly. "I hope I'm not too early." "You're right on time," Samuel replied. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "It's ready." Inside, Clara's eyes widened as she looked at the dresser. Sunlight from the window poured across its surface, catching in the varnish like liquid gold. The cracks and scratches were gone, the handles restored, the shape whole again. She ran her fingers lightly over the smooth edge, her expression softening as if she were touching something alive. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He would have been so proud. Samuel nodded once. "Your father built it well. It just needed to remember itself." She turned to him. "How much do I owe you?" He shook his head. "Nothing. It's already been paid for." Clara frowned slightly, puzzled. "I don't understand." "Let's just say," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "that some work is done for the sake of keeping a promise. Your father left enough behind to make sure it was taken care of." She studied his face, sensing something in his tone she couldn't name. Then, as if afraid to ask more, she only smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said. "Truly." The boy tugged at her sleeve, pointing toward the workbench where Samuel had placed a few small wooden carvings. "Can I see those?" he asked, his voice small and curious. Samuel's mouth lifted in a tired smile. "Take one if you like." The child picked a small carved bird from the table, its wings outstretched, and held it carefully, as though it might fly away. "Did you make this?" "A long time ago," Samuel said, "when my hands were steadier." "Why doesn't it fly?" the boy asked. Samuel chuckled softly. "Maybe it already did. Maybe it's just resting." The boy looked at him seriously, as if considering the logic, then nodded. Clara thanked him again, and they carried the dresser out to her car. She turned once before leaving, standing in the sunlight, and said, "You've given me back something I didn't know I'd lost." When they were gone, the silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not hollow, not empty, but full of something gently settling, like the sound after a final chord fades. Samuel walked back into the workshop and sat at his bench. The note he had written for Clara still lay there, unused. He picked it up, read the words. "Some things are fixed with nails and polish, others with patience," and set it back down. The morning light pooled around him, soft and slow. He sat for a long while, thinking of his daughter, of the laughter that used to echo through this place, of how time had eroded everything except the shape of her smile in his memory. The letter he had hidden for Clara felt like something Emma would have wanted him to do, to give another child what she herself had been denied, a final message of love. It was as if, through this small act, he had been granted a second chance, not to rewrite the past, but to ease it. Later, as the day waned, he made himself tea and returned to the workbench. The air was warm and still. Outside, a cardinal perched on the fence post, its red feather startling against the gray wood. He found his old carving knife and a block of walnut, one of the scraps left from repairing the dresser. He began to carve without thinking, his hands moving by instinct. The wood yielded easily, the shavings curling away like thin ribbons. Slowly, a shape emerged, a pair of wings, delicate, curved. An angel, small enough to fit in a palm. He carved until the light dimmed, until his hands began to ache. Then he set the figure on the table and looked at it with quiet satisfaction. It was simple, imperfect, but alive. Night fell gently. Samuel moved through the house with the slow grace of someone preparing to leave, though he did not yet know where to. He washed his cup, turned off the lights, and stood by the window one last time. The moon was full, its reflection silvering the field. Somewhere far away, a train passed, its whistle low and mournful. He thought of Clara and the boy driving home, the dresser in the back of their car, carrying its secret. He thought of the moment she would open it someday and find the letter waiting, and of how the words would reach her, how they would mend something unseen. When he finally sat down again, his body felt heavy but not tired, the kind of heaviness that comes when a long-kept burden begins to lift. He took out his old notebook, the one filled with sketches and measurements, and turned to a blank page. With a slow hand he wrote, "Every piece of wood carries a voice. Today, I helped one speak again." He paused, then added a final line beneath it. "Now, everything that needed to be said has been said." He left the pen resting across the page. Sleep came quietly, without struggle. He dozed in his chair beside the workbench, the lamp burning low. In the faint light, the carved angel stood beside his notebook, its wings casting twin shadows that merged across the surface of the table. When morning came, Samuel Rhodes did not wake. He was still sitting there, eyes closed, the faintest smile on his lips, as though listening to something distant and kind. The following day, the workshop door remained closed. It was the neighbor, Mrs. Hargreaves, who found him after noticing the light had been burning since the night before. She entered softly, as though stepping into a church, and called his name once before realizing he would not answer. The air smelled faintly of cedar and oil, the familiar scent of his life's work. On the table beside him, she found the small wooden angel, the notebook open to its final page, and the quiet dignity of a man who had done all he could and asked for nothing more. Later that week, the news reached Clara. She had been cleaning the kitchen when her phone rang, the voice on the other end, hesitant and formal, offering condolences. She stood there for a long time afterward, the phone still in her hand, the sound of her child playing in the other room distant and muffled. That afternoon, she drove back to the small house at the end of the lane. The door to the workshop was open now, and sunlight poured in. She stepped inside and felt at once that she was intruding on something sacred. The bench was just as he had left it. She saw the angel, the notebook, the tools laid neatly in their places. On the page before her were his last words. She read them twice, then pressed her fingers to the wood, tracing the carved figure's wings. They were smooth, shaped by patience and love. A faint smile crossed her lips through the tears. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure to whom she was speaking. She took the angel with her, wrapped gently in a handkerchief, and placed it atop the dresser once she returned home. The boy asked about it that evening, his small hands reaching for the figure. "Did the man make it for us?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "He made it so we'd remember something important." "What's that?" "That even quiet people can do great things." The boy looked at the angel thoughtfully, then placed it back on the dresser. Later, when Clara began unpacking clothes into the newly repaired drawers, one of them stuck for a moment. She tugged gently, and the side panel shifted just slightly under her hand. Curious, she pressed along the edge and felt it give way. Behind it lay a small space, dark and shallow, just big enough to hold a folded cloth bundle. Her breath caught. She reached inside and drew it out. The cloth was old, faded green. The knot slipped loose easily, revealing an envelope and a few folded bills. She recognized her father's handwriting at once. For a long time, she could not open it. Her hands trembled as she stared at the familiar loops of his script, the way he always crossed his T's with too much pressure. When she finally unfolded the paper, the words blurred before her eyes. "My dear Clara." She read it slowly, aloud, her voice breaking halfway through. Her son came to her side and rested his head against her arm, though he didn't understand. When she finished, she folded the letter again, pressed it to her lips, and let out a long, shuddering breath. It was as if the man who wrote it had been waiting all these years for her to find him again. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat beside the dresser, the letter on her lap, the angel watching from the top. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock. She thought of Samuel, of his hands, his patience, the calm in his voice. Somehow she knew he had found the letter and chosen silence. She could feel his kindness woven into every repaired joint, every polished edge. And she understood that in his silence there had been intention, a gift that let her discover her father's words as though they had been meant for this exact moment. When morning came, sunlight spilled across the floor. The letter lay beside her, the ink glimmering faintly in the new light. She stood, placed it carefully in the top drawer, and closed it gently. Then she lifted the wooden angel and set it on top again, next to a framed photograph of her father. Years later, when the boy was older, he would ask about the man who fixed the dresser, and she would tell him the story. The quiet man who could hear what Wood was trying to say, who listened so deeply that even the dead could speak through his hands. And the boy would smile, tracing the smooth wings of the angel as his mother once had, and understand that not all letters need to be written to reach their destination. In time, the small house on the hill grew quiet again, but the dresser remained a vessel of memory, a bridge between what was lost and what endured. And somewhere beyond words, beyond time, 2 fathers and 2 daughters were joined by the same unseen thread, their voices meeting in the silence they left behind. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other stories on the channel. Each one carries its own hidden truth. And if you know someone who would feel this one the way you did, share it with them.